Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Chapter 10 of our Democracies at War lectures. We will have a look today at the moral justifications that Western liberal democracies put forward when they decide to launch the war that they waged, that they have been waging since the end of the Cold War, the moral standards that they claim they apply. And I would like to start chapter 10 with the first point, which is related, of course, to the last point of chapter 9. What did we see last week? We saw that Western mainstream media do not play the role of a fourth estate, checking and why not criticizing the government's actions, decisions, and justifications. They rather are our government's little helpers. They can be considered to be weapons of mass communication, weapons of mass distraction, to use the term of the New York Times public editor. And the complementarity between the argumentation put forward by the media on the one hand and the executive power on the other hand basically reflects what the American media student Daniel Hellin called the sphere of consensus. In today's lecture, ladies and gentlemen, I will put forward the hypothesis that this consensus has its roots in a kind of shared post-Cold War conviction, according to which the international community, which we equate to Western liberal democracies, we are living in a world in which the international community has the rights and even the duty or the responsibility to act in favor of populations, victims of genocide, victims of massive violations of human rights, victims of ethnic cleansing, of crimes against humanity. I would like to quote Michael Barnett. One of his books, The Empire of Humanity, is the title of his book. I quote, "The international community is committed to the protection of people from unfavorable conditions, from others, and from themselves. From unfavorable conditions," this refers to underdeveloped states of societies, pretty often called failed states or collapsed states or fragile states or shadow weak states. From others, we should protect people from others, that is to say, when they are attacked by aggressive neighbors, and from themselves, that is to say, when they are victims of rogue regimes, of autocratic repressive governments. And according to this view, according to this conviction, the international community has the right and the duty to intervene, sometimes forcibly. That is to say, it should not hesitate to resort to violent means, to military force, in order precisely to protect lives, endangered, imperiled lives. This conviction, ladies and gentlemen, has been summed up by many people, but maybe there is one speech which perfectly fits this, which perfectly corresponds to this conviction. It is Tony Blair's a speech called The Doctrine of the International Community, a speech that he held in Chicago on April 24, 1999, that is to say, during NATO's Operation Allied Force in Kosovo against Milosevic's government, the Serbian government of Milosevic. Let's have a look at some excerpts of this speech. In Europe, awful crimes that we did not believe were possible have reappeared. I quote, ethnic cleansing, systemic rape, mass murder. No one in the West who has seen what is happening in Kosovo can doubt that NATO's military action is justified. NATO's military action has started some 5 weeks earlier in the midst of March as far as I remember. This is a just war, I quote Tony Blair, because it's based not on any territorial ambitions, but on values. Tony Blair makes a reference to appeasement policies, which in the past already permitted dictators to behave aggressively, an allusion, of course, to Hitler and to Great Britain's appeasement policies of the 1930s. He explicitly designates two dangerous, I quote, and ruthless men, Saddam Hussein and Slobodan Milosevic, whose behavior is synonymous with calamity on their own peoples. And this is the reason why NATO cannot afford to fail in its intervention in Kosovo. And then he goes beyond the specific case of Kosovo by thinking of how the so-called international community should act in the future in order to which framework it should establish in order precisely to permit the protection of basic human rights. Look at that. We have to identify the circumstances in which we should get actively involved in other people's conflicts. So we have the right to get involved in conflicts that take place in other places. Non-interference has long been considered an important principle of international order. It goes back to the UN Charter, if not to the Westphalian treaties. We come back to this. But, and here then is the change that he is eager to propose. The principle of non-interference must be qualified in important respects. So we should no longer stick to this principle. Acts of genocide can never be a purely internal matter. That is to say, we should have the right to intervene in those states where people are victims of genocide. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel free to compare this speech with the one held by Vladimir Putin a bit more than 1 month ago, February 24, 2022, when he announced what he called the special military operation in Ukraine. Once again, let's have a look at some excerpts. In Donbass, the two separatist regions in Ukraine, the forces that staged the coup in Ukraine in 2014 have seized power. They are keeping it, and it is impossible to settle the situation by peaceful means. So Putin himself, this is what he says, cannot look without compassion at what is happening in Donbass. For him, it is impossible to tolerate this. And he has, therefore, to stop that atrocity, that genocide, the same expression, of the millions of people, according to him, who are victims of genocide and who live there and who, to some extent, are close to Russia. So the conclusion then that he draws is that we, the Russians, have to take bold and immediate action. Therefore, he decided to launch this special military operation. The purpose, I quote, of this operation is to protect people, just as Blair was eager to protect the population of Kosovo. The purpose of this operation is to protect people who, for 8 years now, since 2014, have been facing humiliation and genocide. And it is not our plan to occupy the Ukrainian territory. When we compare these two speeches, I can't help from thinking that there are many common points. Parallels between the two speeches are obviously impressive. There is a common reference to past mistakes, to past disasters due precisely to appeasement policies. Both refer to World War II to Hitler's behavior. They both stigmatize extremists, the Nazi Ukrainians, the drug-addicted Nazis in Kiev, according to Putin, Milosevic and Saddam Hussein, as regards Tony Blair. They put forward the same justification why military action is necessary. It is necessary, according to both of them, in order to protect the minorities that are victims of genocide for Putin, of genocide and ethnic cleansing for Tony Blair. They also are eager both to establish the necessity of a trial in order for the guilty extremists to be judged. And of course, both emphasize that the war that they fight is not interested in territorial conquest. So two speeches, very similar, and yet, of course, should I say, despite these common points, we are, or at least we used to be, as much seduced by Tony Blair's arguments as we are somehow disgusted by those of Putin. The question then is the following on: why do we perceive Putin as a liar, as a killer, as a butcher, to quote Biden's two expressions that he used last year for killer, last week for butcher? Why do we consider Putin not to be credible with his justification? And why do we sympathize with Tony Blair's arguments and action? The action concerned was NATO's Operation Allied Force in Kosovo from March to June 1999. So my response to this question is the following one. Maybe this is due to the fact that we spontaneously here in the West, of course, we spontaneously establish a link between the defense of human rights, of basic human rights, and Western values. Maybe we agree with Tony Blair because we postulate that if the defense of basic human rights requires to resort to violence, only liberal states are likely to resort to such legitimate violence. To put it differently, we perceive the so-called international community to be synonymous with the West. And the evidence of this, of the validity of this evidence, of this hypothesis, ladies and gentlemen, is provided by the Western states' intervention 12 years after Kosovo, that is to say in 2011, in March 2011, in Libya against Gaddafi's regime. Let's have a look at the arguments put forward at that time in French media, in French newspapers, editorials, and then appeals by French public intellectuals. First, article, an editorial of Le Monde. Look at some core sentences of this argument. Time has come to help the Libyan rebellion. The abuses perpetrated by Gaddafi's regime amount to hundreds of deaths, torture, arbitrary arrests, and disappearances of opponents. According to Le Monde, we know what Gaddafi is capable of, and therefore it takes a military gesture to help the rebels' sanctuary, Benghazi, the city where the rebels had gathered. Americans and Europeans have the means to do so. They have the military means of a military gesture. It is time to implement. We should no longer wait because it would be too late. That is exactly the argument of the second editorial that I would like you to have a look at, Le Figaro. The dream of a free Libya risks turning into a nightmare if we do nothing to stop Gaddafi. Up to now, we are doing nothing. No one is doing anything. America is dithering. Europe is paralyzed. Rather than thinking about the possible negative consequences of the intervention, we had better assess the cost of our inaction. What may happen if we do not intervene? Doing nothing, this is Le Figaro's analysis, will have consequences far beyond Libya. Soon, it will be too late. It will be too late to intervene, so we should not wait any longer. And last but not least, this appeal by French intellectuals, exactly the same argumentation. Time is running out in Libya. The dictator Gaddafi crushes the efforts of the Libyan people who are trying to free themselves. It was the context of the Arab Spring that had started first in Tunisia, then in Egypt, and then in Libya. Should we wait until we have reached a sufficient level of massacre? We must. The response is no, we should not wait. Why? Because we must intervene quickly. It is now, immediately, that we must act. Now, right away, that we must put an end to the executioner, to Gaddafi and his regime. So, the question I would like to provide a tentative answer to in today's lecture, ladies and gentlemen, is the following one. Where does our tendency to favor military interventions in civil wars taking place in other states, where does this tendency come from? And my analysis will consist in showing that it is the result, this tendency, this appetency, is the result of an evolution which combines the triumph of human rights, in the Western definition of human rights, as the highest value that should be protected. So the combination of this triumph with the rediscovery of past Western military intervention, military expeditions that already were justified by humanitarian arguments. And it is my claim that in doing so, our Western liberal democracies actually act illiberally, or at least their conception of liberalism is debatable. There are other versions of liberalism. And I do consider that the behavior is illiberal, all the more so it is basically a paternalist. It is a vehicle of paternalism. So let's have a look at these different points. And let's start with the definition of what a humanitarian intervention actually consists in. The definition that I propose is due to Holzgräfe in the book that he edited together with Keohane, Humanitarian Intervention, Ethical, Legal, and Political Dilemmas. He defines humanitarian interventions, I quote, as the threat or use of force across state borders, by a state or by a group of states, of course, whose aim is to prevent or to put an end to widespread violations of the fundamental human rights of individuals other than the citizens of the states that intervene, and without the permission of the state within which this intervention takes place. So three major points. A humanitarian intervention first consists in the use or the threat of force in another state's domestic setting because of this other state's massively violating the basic human rights of its own population. And this intervention takes place against the willingness, or at least without the explicit authorization of the government of the state concerned, the state where this intervention takes place. I will, of course, here focus on actual use of force and not threat of force. Why? Because I'm interested in the wars that the Western democracies have been fighting. And out of the 7 wars fought by Western liberal democracies since the end of the Cold War, 5 are concerned by humanitarian interventions, 3 directly, that is to say, they were launched explicitly on the basis of these humanitarian morality. It was the case in Bosnia, 1995. It was the case in Kosovo, 1999, and in Libya, 2011. Things are a bit more complicated in Afghanistan, 2001, Operation Enduring Freedom, and Iraq, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom. Why? Because the initial reason of the intervention was different one, was not the humanitarian one regarding, we saw this regarding Afghanistan. The aim was to topple the Taliban regime guilty of protecting Al-Qaeda, which had staged the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And We saw the sinister interest pursued by the Bush administration when attacking Iraq in 2003. But in these two cases, the state-building operations that were implemented after the military operations strictly defined also were based on the necessity to permit human rights to be protected in the two states concerned. So 3 direct corroborations and 2 indirect corroborations of humanitarian reasons or justifications in our post-Cold War wars. So humanitarian interventions, we'll come back to definitions, are undertaken without the permission of the states concerned where these interventions take place. That is to say, they violate the state's sovereignty, or at least the traditional conception of sovereignty. We'll come back to this, which amounts to saying that these interventions also do not respect the UN Charter, which is based on the sovereignty principle. The sovereignty principle synonymous with non-interference in another state's domestic affairs. And to some extent, if Putin's war is considered to be an aggression, one of the arguments precisely consists in saying that it violates the sovereignty of Ukraine. So my idea is to try to understand how this is possible. How is it possible that military interventions can be undertaken against the sovereignty principle, which is the core principle, the core norm of the UN Charter? And I do think that it is possible due to an evolution which is both legal and ideational, ideological, but I prefer ideational. And these evolutions, of course, took place on the background of a very significant political change, the end of the Cold War and the emergence of Western hegemony and more specifically American hegemony. So the legal evolution first. Regarding the UN Charter, it explicitly mentions that the aim of the UN when they were created in 1945 was to maintain or to restore international peace and security. The aim of the UN was to, I quote the preamble, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And therefore, the different member states, by definition, did have to commit themselves to no longer resort to violent means of conflict resolutions. Article 2, paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or the political independence of any state. So all the states should stop short from going to war. But of course, the founding fathers of the United Nations knew that this would not necessarily be the case. Not all the states would respect their promise. And therefore, Article 51 of the UN Charter, this is chapter 7, recognizes an exception, acknowledges that there can be an exception to this rule. When a state has been attacked, it has the right to resort to force in order to repel the aggressor. Article 21, nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent rights of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. So individual self-defense when the state has the capacity to defend itself, or collective self-defense when the state appeals to the other states to help it against the aggressor. This, for instance, had been the case in 1990 when Iraq aggressed Kuwait. Kuwait was unable to defend itself, so it appealed to the members of the UN, which referred to collective self-defense and resorted to first Operation Desert Shield and then Operation Desert Storm to force Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops, thus permitting the violated sovereignty of Kuwait to be re-established. So there is a right of self-defense. This right of self-defense, however, should be implemented under the control of the UN Security Council, which therefore has a kind of formal authority when it comes to go to war. So self-defense is possible, etc., until, I go on, quoting Article 51, until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. So states can defend themselves, but the measures that they take in order to do so, they have to be reported to the Security Council, which then will take all the necessary measures in order to permit international peace and international security to be restored. So there is a formal hierarchy favorable to the UN Security Council, which to some extent, in the mind of the founding fathers of the UN, and first and foremost America's President Roosevelt, the UN Security Council has virtually unlimited powers for the maintenance of international peace and security. When a war breaks out, it belongs to the Security Council to adopt those decisions, those resolutions, those measures likely to permit peace and security to prevail again. The problem, however, with this principle is that in order for this to be the case, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council have to agree among one another, because they have the privilege of having the veto right. They can oppose any resolution that they do disagree with. What does that mean? This means that only when their interests, their national interests, egoistically defined, are not at stake, are they likely to agree. And in this case, are they likely to adopt those measures likely to put an end to a war that broke out between 2 states that are not among these 5 permanent members. Only when regional, local wars not directly affecting the permanent 5 members' national interests are the 5 policemen, to quote Roosevelt, are likely to play their role of maintaining international peace and international security. And when we look at the empirical record of the Cold War, this is actually what happened. Very rarely did the UN Security Council, was the Security Council able to agree upon a common resolution. For instance, in the war opposing Pakistan and India, for instance, in the wars opposing Israel to Egypt, this was possible, regional conflicts. And what was precisely possible? It was possible for the UN Security Council to adopt a resolution which authorized that blue helmets, that is a UN peacekeeping forces, would be deployed to separate the belligerents in the on one hand, Pakistan on the other hand, or Israel and the Arab states on the other hand. Peacekeeping blue helmets in, ladies and gentlemen, is important in the very strict, in the very narrow meaning of the term. That is to say, the blue helmets were sent in order to separate these belligerents with the authorization of the belligerents concerned. That is to say, these belligerents themselves had already agreed upon a kind of ceasefire, and they accepted the deployment of blue helmets on the basis of the UN Security Council resolution in order somehow to stabilize, to consolidate the distance, the physical distance between the between the troops of the 2 belligerents, which amounts to saying that the very first peacekeeping operations in international wars, interstate wars, respected the sovereignty principle as precisely the UN Charter is supposed to do. However, this solution, given that only regional wars to some extent were likely to profit from these peacekeeping operations, this situation was not satisfactory all the more so, the basic aim, remember, of the UN was to prevent new wars from breaking out. So I'd like to quote Ramesh Thakur in his book. He considers these peacekeeping operations to be a damage limitation, whose aim was to contain conflicts and not to prevent them, and not either to solve, to bring definitive solutions to these conflicts. Only the states concerned themselves were likely to do so, and if they did not, the state of war continued, as precisely is the case between India and Pakistan, and to some extent also between Israel and various Arab states, though some of them until since then agreed in signing peace agreements with Israel. So the situation was not satisfying, and therefore, and maybe to some extent, maybe the UN was eager to prove that it was useful. Maybe it was eager to overcome, to prove that it was able to overcome the paralysis due to the Cold War rivalry between East and West. It decided, so it came to the conclusion that maybe peacekeeping operations should be put into practice, not merely in international wars, but also in civil wars, in civil conflicts that took place within states. And thus, gradually, and notably, I would say from the second half of the 80s onwards, more and more peacekeeping operations, and also in the 90s, more and more peacekeeping operations were implemented in civil wars, notably in Latin America or Central America, in the southern part of Africa, in the western countries of Africa too, in Cambodia, where civil wars had occurred. And not merely were peacekeeping operations implemented in these civil wars, but peacekeeping operations strictly defined were supplemented by peacemaking operations and by peace building operations. So we should make a difference between these three kinds of operations, which all do respect the sovereignty of the states concerned. Peacemaking is a step further than peacekeeping, that is to say, not merely do the blue helmets separate the troops of belligerents, but they also contribute to establish confidence, they propose confidence building measures, exchange of prisoners, a disarmament of the soldiers concerned, for instance, etc. And peace building still goes another step further. It consists to consolidate the peace by notably helping to organize plural elections, whose aim is to permit a government to emerge, and this government should be recognized by all the parties, those that were favorable during the civil war to the government, and those that were opposed to the government. By definition, in the civil war, at least one of the belligerents is eager to get rid of the existing political authority. So there was a gradual shift in the nature of peacekeeping operations. And this shift, ladies and gentlemen, I think is due basically to a normative evolution. So the legal evolution with its practical consequence is also ascribable, I think so, to a normative evolution, which goes back, I would say, to the 70s, to the second half of the 70s. Remember the origin of the United Nations. The United Nations at the beginning were the United Nations against the Axis powers, against Nazi Germany, against the fascist Italy, against Imperial Japan. But it was Nazi Germany which was considered to be, I would say, responsible for the outbreak of World War II. So when the United Nations were created, the aim was to prevent a new world war from breaking out. No more wars, to some extent, was the aim pursued, and therefore the major aim is, of the UN Charter, explicitly mentioned in the UN Charter, is to maintain international peace and security. But Hitler had not merely practiced an expansionist aggressive behavior towards neighbors. He also, the Nazi regime had also proceeded to internal mass killings, the Holocaust. 6 million of Jews were killed. Up to the 80s, only the first behavior, the aggressive international behavior of Hitler, dominated the mind of the United Nations. From the 80s onwards, to some extent, the second characteristic of the Nazi dictatorship, the Nazi totalitarianism, was rediscovered. That is to say, the massive violation of human rights. And thus, logically, the question that emerged was, the conclusion that was drawn was consisting in saying we should also avoid any repetition of massive human rights violations. Human rights, ladies and gentlemen, are mentioned in the UN Charter. They are mentioned in the UN Charter, for instance, in the preamble. I quote, the preamble of the UN Charter proclaims its faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. So human rights are explicitly mentioned. The same is true in Article 1, stipulating that the achievement of international cooperation should contribute to solve international problems of economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character. Humanitarian character. International cooperation should promote and encourage respect for human rights, for the fundamental freedoms of all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. So one of the purposes of the United Nations, explicitly mentioned, is the protection of human rights. But, and I quote Samuel Moyn in his book, The Last Utopia, these human rights, though they were mentioned, their value, their importance was, I quote, symbolic. Their appearance was ornamental. Why? Because throughout the Cold War, the non-interference principle was prevailing. And this non-interference principle was due to the decolonization process. All the states that were to form after the independence, the Third World, were opposed to any former colonial power, the French, the British, etc., to dictate what these states, the governments of these states, should do in their own domestic setting. So no interference, and therefore no monitoring of the human rights. So the human rights were neglected throughout the Cold War. And actually, there is only one reference to human rights throughout the Cold War. It occurred in 1975 at the Helsinki summit, the Conference for Cooperation and Security in Europe, which gathered all the Western and Eastern European states, plus the US and Canada. And this Helsinki summit, this Helsinki Accords, adopted 10 principles that should guide the states concerned. The Declaration on Principles guiding relations between participating states. And this decalogue, 10 principles, were the following ones: sovereign equality, respect for the rights inherent in sovereignty, no use of force, respect of the borders, peaceful settlement of disputes, etc., non-intervention in domestic affairs, and here then we have the human rights, and respect for human rights, respect for fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of thought, of conscience, of religion, or belief. So the Helsinki summit, the Helsinki Declaration, somehow repeats the same contradiction as the UN Charter. On the one hand, non-interference, on the one hand, sovereignty, but on the other hand, respect for fundamental human rights. And when the declaration was adopted at the Helsinki conference, the different participating states had different ideas in mind, and they actually were not that, did not acknowledge any somehow significant importance to human rights. The Soviets, of course, were interested in non-interference and the territorial integrity in order, notably, to permit Eastern Germany to remain communist. Western Germany, when they signed the declaration, when they adopted the declaration, was conversely interested in permitting a kind of relaxation of notably personal private relationships between Western Germans and Eastern Germans. Their families had been brutally separated when the Berlin Wall was established in 1961. And as regards the US, I would like to quote Henry Kissinger, the then Secretary of State, alluding to the third basket of, so-called third basket of the human rights that are mentioned explicitly in the Helsinki Agreement. He said these human rights provisions could have been written, I quote, in Swahili, as far as I care. So he was not interested in human rights, and he did not believe that they could have a somehow significant impact upon international politics. He was right. He was wrong, sorry. He was wrong. Why? Because in the Eastern European countries, in the communist bloc, different citizens, and more specifically the dissidents, took the Helsinki Declaration seriously. That is to say, they, on the basis of this legal text that had been signed by Moscow, by East Berlin, by Warsaw, by Budapest, etc., by Prague, they asked their communist governments to respect their individual freedom of thought, their freedom of belief, their freedom of conscience. And their fight, the fight of the dissidents for more freedom in the communist world, was supported in the West by those who adopted human rights as a value to be protected. That this is what Samuel Moyn calls the last utopia. Human rights are the last utopia. When he wrote his book in 2011, maybe there's a new one, environmental protection. It's another question. Anyway, human rights so emerged in the West. They emerged in the West in the 70s, and they replaced first the traditional conception of human rights, which was at the same time consisting in defending human rights, the rights of men and of citizens. You know, the title of the French Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, Declaration of the rights of men and of citizens. That is to say, in the French Revolution, the same was true in the American one, and the same was true throughout the Enlightenment century, and up, I would say, to World War II. The rights of men were inherently rights of citizens. That is to say, a man could only see his rights guaranteed as a citizen within a state, within a collective political unit, community. Human rights were not separated from the right to participate, at least indirectly, in the political life of a country. And the second conception of human rights that was replaced in the West from the 70s onwards was the one that had prevailed in the Third World after World War II, that is to say, the collective right of self-determination. Throughout the years going from World War II, the beginning of decolonization, up to the last colony that became free, independent in the midst of the 70s, the former Portuguese colonies, third world leaders, third world intellectuals could not conceive of human rights without the collective right of their nation to be independent. I would like to quote the Saudi Arabian representative at the UN in 1952. What we are asking, we people from the third world, is that the people living in the non-self-governing territories, there were still many colonies at that time, people living in the non-self-governing territories should be free. This is what we are asking. They cannot enjoy any human rights unless they are free. So the condition for human rights to prosper beyond the West was that the states, the countries to which they belonged, would be genuinely independent states and no longer colonies, as had been the case throughout centuries. So human rights in the Western meaning replaced these two conceptions. And this happened, I would say, during the second half of the 70s, at the very beginning of the 80s. When I was a student, ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning of the 80s in Paris, I saw what I never had seen before. I saw that the noble cause that the students from Sciences Po Paris were defending were precisely the rights of Soviet dissidents, of Eastern European dissidents, whose basic human rights were violated in the communist regimes. Dissidents in general, and more specifically the so-called refusniks. Refusniks were those Jewish citizens of the Soviet Union who were eager to get out of the Soviet Union, to migrate to Israel, and their right to leave the Soviet Union was denied to them by the Soviet administration. So it is their cause which some students at Sciences Po Paris defended. And I understood a bit later that these students were part of one specific non-government organization whose importance grew more and more, Amnesty International. So Amnesty International became the non-governmental organization whose cause was the defense of human rights, and at the beginning, notably, the human rights of dissidents in the Eastern European communist countries. Amnesty International claimed that it was beyond and above politics, that it was driven by moral values and not by partisan political aims. It claimed that it wanted not to change the world, as left-wing students had done, notably May 68, etc., in Paris, not to change the world, but to save the world one individual at a time. So it was a very concrete grassroots movement, and it launched individual campaigns to exert pressures upon the governments, and it worked. The Soviet governments ended up permitting at least some of their refuseniks and some of their dissidents to leave the USSR. In France, this promotion was, the promotion of human rights was adopted by some typical French intellectuals, Bernard Lévy, André Glucksmann. They had been former far left activists, Maoists, of the Maoist style. Why? Because being Maoist, they could criticize the Stalinist betrayal of the communist revolution to some extent. And once Mao's crimes during the Cultural Revolution, once the Red Khmer's genocide in Cambodia was known in the West, they logically dropped the Maoist doctrine, and they adopted this new utopia, the last utopia, according to Samuel Moyn, that is to say, the defense of human rights. The same thing happened in the US, where beyond Amnesty International, one specific American president claimed that his foreign policy was driven by the defense of human rights. This was Jimmy Carter. Listen to his inaugural speech in January 77. Because we are free, we Americans, we can never be indifferent to the state of freedom elsewhere. Our commitment to human rights must be absolute. Our commitment to human rights must be absolute. And what did he do? Well, his administration accepted to talk to Soviet dissidents, to meet with them when they had managed to get out of the Soviet Union. So he met with Solzhenitsyn, the novelist, with Sakharov, the former scientist who is at the origin of the Soviet nuclear bomb, with Bukovsky, another very famous dissident at that time. He also, Jimmy Carter, intervened in favor of left-wing opponents in the Latin American dictatorships, right-wing dictatorships in Chile, notably in Argentina. Left-wing opponents were jailed sometimes killed, and counter also defended the human rights of these left-wing dissidents or opponents. Once, however, Reagan came to power. When Reagan arrived at the White House in 1981, this impartiality no longer prevailed, and Reagan, who had designated the USSR as the evil empire, of course, used human rights as an ideological instrument in his fight against the Soviet Union. That is to say, human rights were only considered to be violated in communist regimes. Anyway, what is beyond doubt is that gradually human rights arrived on the international agenda. And the link with our humanitarian intervention, ladies and gentlemen, is the following one. When the Cold War came to an end, Amnesty International and other NGOs that became more and more numerous, Human Rights Watch, etc., they became aware that human rights were violated not merely in the former had been violated not merely in the former communist states, since there were no more communist states, or at least there were no more communist states in Europe. Human rights also had been and still were massively violated, and even more massively to some extent, in many, many autocratic states of the third world, those precisely who had emphasized the right of non-interference. This right of non-interference, this principle of non-interference had protected the very brutal repression of the populations in these states by their own governments. So the question asked by the activists favorable to human rights is, how can we protect these human rights in third world states? What should we do in order to protect them? And the answer was the following one: we must enforce peace. And peace enforcement thus became the new policy beyond peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. Peace enforcement against the sovereignty of the state concerned, because the authorities in these states, of course, did not accept that Western states or Western NGOs did interfere in their domestic affairs in order to stop the massive violations of human rights. So peace enforcement operations were conceived of, also due to two other concepts that had emerged in the meantime: the concept of the right to interfere, or the duty to interfere, which became the right to interfere. The duty to interfere proposed by the so-called French doctors without borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, that had been created by the French Bernard Kouchner as early as in the 60s, when he intervened in Biafra, that is to say in the civil war in Nigeria, in order to save human lives, threatened by the civil war, threatened by famine, threatened by different catastrophes, etc. And the duty to interfere became the right to interfere in order to protect human security. This is the second concept. Human security is more important than national security, according to this perspective, of course. Why? Well, because the majority of people living in the world, and all the more so in the South, in the global South, are not victims of aggression by their neighbors, as is implicitly the case when we use the term of national security. No, the majority of people in the global South, it is their human security which is at stake because of the so-called soft threats: hunger, lack of safe drinking water, endemic diseases. And their human security is at stake because of the behavior of their own security forces. That is to say, that the political regimes are repressive, and their human security is endangered because of the so-called new wars. New wars were the term used by some Western European scholars to define those civil wars that broke out in Africa, but also in Yugoslavia, New wars because no longer driven by political motives, but waged by warlords, savage warlords who were interested in making money and who did not hesitate to resort to atrocities against the populations concerned. And the concept of new war was put forward by Mary Kaldor, who had also been a leftist intellectual or leftist scholar in the 70s and the 80s. She had been part of the anti-nuclear movement in Great Britain, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, well, she changed the topic that she was interested in and coined this expression of the new war. So the aim of all these activists was to protect human rights and to promote human security, to respond to emergency situations. And therefore, peace enforcement now became necessary, was perceived to be necessary. Enforcement is the crucial term, ladies and gentlemen. When a state, or the government of a state, within which massive violations of human rights take place, refuses intervention, refuses peacekeeping or peace building or peacemaking, then peace enforcement will have to be put into practice on the basis of a UN resolution, UN Security Council resolution, referring either to the risks of the massive violations of human rights for international peace and security, the traditional argument, or on the basis of the massive violation of human rights as such, given the new reading of the UN Charter, that is to say, the rediscovery of the human rights mentioned, I said this in the preamble, and in Article 1 of the UN Charter. Basically, or actually, the two arguments are pretty often put forward. The civil wars as such violate human rights and may also endanger international peace. Peace enforcement, therefore, is necessary. And since the term enforcement is, I would say, pejorative, or at least potentially pejorative, it was gradually replaced by the politically correct term humanitarian intervention. But the humanitarian intervention consists in enforcing, as you say, imposing violently a peace. The first humanitarian intervention, ladies and gentlemen, is the post-Cold War period, started in Somalia. It was launched in Somalia in 1992. A civil war had broken out. The state had collapsed. There were many warlords fighting against one another in order to try to control the situation. So blue helmets were deployed, but they were unable to re-establish stability. The blue helmets, I forgot to say this, not merely are deployed with the authorization of the states concerned or the state concerned, but also they only have a defensive mission. So they cannot impose peace. They only can defend themselves and try to maintain the status quo, but they cannot go further. So since they were unable to re-establish stability, American troops intervened after a media campaign in the US inciting George Bush, father George Herbert Bush at that time, to intervene in order to protect human rights precisely. So American troops intervened, were sent, they landed, and the media took films, so it was shown on American TV, so-called CNN effects, which had emerged with, which had been invented during Operation Desert Storm. That is to say, what was taking place somewhere in the world could be watched directly in your living room on your TV screen. And what happened? Well, first, Pakistani peacekeepers were killed by the different factions, civil war factions in Somalia, and what's more, 18 US Rangers were killed, the heaviest casualty of the US since the end of the Vietnam War. And of course, the American Congress refused to go on being present in Somalia. The US decided to withdraw, and this first peace enforcement was a failure. Operation was a failure. And this failure explains then the passivity of the United Nations in 1994 when the genocide in Rwanda occurred, 800,000 victims, 800,000 Tutsis killed by the regime of the Hutus in Rwanda. France also played a very ambiguous role, to say the least, in the crisis concerned. So passivity in Rwanda, and somehow similar passivity, ladies and gentlemen, prevailed at the beginning of the civil war in Yugoslavia. Civil war that broke out after the breakup of Yugoslavia, after the end of the Cold War. First Slovenia, and then Croatia, and then Bosnia claimed to become independent. And in Bosnia, a civil war broke out because the population is there's 1/3 of Serbs, 1/3 of Croatians, and 1/3 of Bosnians or Bosniaks, Muslims in Bosnia. And this is due to the Ottoman Empire being present up to World War I. And this civil war in Bosnia caused the death of some 100,000 victims. The passivity lasted up to 1995. Once again, France refused an intervention. Mitterrand refused to intervene militarily against Serbia. The passivity lasted up to 1995. As you say, up to the massacre of Srebrenica in July 1995. 7,000 Bosnian men and boys were killed by the Serbs, and they were killed in a zone which was supposed to be protected by UN peacekeepers, peacekeepers in the strict meaning of the term. The Dutch Blue Helmets, there is no UN army, you know that. So the Blue Helmets are a part of the armies of the member states of the UN. In this case, the Blue Helmets were Dutch Blue Helmets. They refused to intervene, and they could not intervene, once again, because of their defensive mission to some extent. So this massacre incited the Western leaders to change their mind. Chirac also had meanwhile become the French presidents, and Clinton and Chirac decided that NATO should intervene in order to bomb Serbia to permit, to put an end to the massacres in Bosnia of the Bosnian population by notably the Serbs. The Croatians too killed some Bosnians. This permitted this civil war to come to an end. An agreement was reached, Dayton Accords, which is at the basis still of today's political situation, political institutions in Bosnia. The operation concerned was Operation Deliberate Force. And it had been launched after a UN Security Council resolution, that is to say, on the basis of the multilateral UN Charter. It was legal, strictly speaking. Things will be different in 1999 in Kosovo, where NATO launched its Operation Allied Force. No UN security authorization. Why? Because the Russians had announced, and the Chinese too, that they would oppose their veto to any UN resolution permitting the intervention of NATO troops to put an end to what? To put an end to the ethnic cleansing that was taking place in Kosovo. Tony Blair makes an allusion to this in the speech that I quoted at the very beginning of today's lecture. Kosovo was a part of Serbia, the southern part of Serbia in the former Yugoslavian Republic, the Socialist, the Communist Republic. It had been an autonomous territory within Serbia. And after the breakup of Yugoslavia, it still was part of Serbia. It is populated by a huge majority of Kosovars of Albanian ethnicity, as distinguished from the Serbs. And the Serbian government thus decided to proceed to ethnic cleansing. That is to say, it forced 1.5 million Kosovars, to almost 90% of the population, to leave Kosovo in order, to some extent, to reach a Serbian majority. And more than 1,000 villages and towns were destroyed, burned down, looted by the Serbian army. So the sanctions did not convince Milosevic to change his policy. What did the Western states do? They decided to intervene militarily without any UN security resolution. Without any UN security resolution on March 24. How then did the Western states justify this action, since it was no longer multilateral and therefore not legal, strictly speaking? Well, they made a difference between legitimacy, the legitimacy of the action, and the legal dimension. That is, though being somehow illegal as regards international tax, international law, it was legitimate because human rights, and this is the argument, because human rights are more important than international positive law. This argument was put forward notably by the then Czech President Václav Havel, who had been one of the dissidents of Charter 77, that is to say the Czechoslovakian dissidents of the 1970s after Helsinki. This is what he said. It is a war fought over principles and values that showed not disrespect for international law, but respect for the higher law of human rights than of state sovereignty. Human rights are more important than state sovereignty. If then we cannot protect human rights because of the sovereignty principle, the non-interference principle, then we should no longer respect this principle. Human rights are more important. The same, or similar at least, argumentation was put forward by the then German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joschka Fischer, member of the Green Party. The Green Party, whose slogan had been "Never again war, never again war," thinking, of course, of alluding to Germany's past, Nazi responsible, guilty of World War II. No more war. So he was favorable to Germany participating in NATO's Operation Allied Force. So when asked if this was not somehow incoherent or contradictory to the principles of his political party, this is what he said. I, Fischer, stand on two principles. Never again war, never again Auschwitz. Never again genocide, never again fascism. For me, both belong together. So if there is a risk of a new Auschwitz because of the ethnic cleansing that the Serbs are proceeding to against the population of Kosovo, then never again war is less important. We should focus on never again Auschwitz rather than never again war, which amounts to saying that war sometimes may be the lesser evil to prevent a new Auschwitz, a new genocide. And last but not least, Tony Blair, as I already mentioned, was favorable, of course, to this intervention in the speech that I quoted. This speech ended with, we need to find a new way to make the UN and its Security Council work. We need to find a new way. If then it is impossible to find a new way, well, then we have to do it alone. We have to do it alone. This was the conclusion drawn by Tony Blair and put into practice by the Western states. If the UN is paralyzed, the Security Council, because of the risk of a veto, notably by either the Russians and or the Chinese, then the Western liberal states have themselves to proceed to the military or humanitarian intervention. The international community, to put it differently, is synonymous with the Western world. And this precisely is the argument put forward by one of the spokespersons favorable to humanitarian intervention, the legal scholar Fernando Tesson, of Argentinian and American citizenship, in his humanitarian intervention. Listen to Fernando Tesson. I define humanitarian intervention as the use of military force undertaken, listen to this, undertaken in principle by a liberal government or alliance, by a liberal government or an alliance, by a set of liberal Western states aimed at ending tyranny or anarchy, welcomed by the victims. In this case, the population of Kosovo welcomed the military intervention, the use of force by the liberal governments, the alliance of liberal states, NATO, in order to end tyranny or anarchy. Tyranny is synonymous with, I quote Tesson, too much government, that is a repressive government, that is to say what the American administration at that time called a rogue regime or rogue state. Anarchy, in Tesson's definition of humanitarian intervention, anarchy means too little government, that is to say a failed state where the populations are victims of the fact that the state is not a genuine state and the government does not do what it is supposed to do, is unable to provide all at once even security or even the mere survival of the peoples concerned. So liberal governments should intervene when it comes to humanitarian interventions. This approach, of course, is refused by definition by non-liberal governments, by non-Western governments. If NATO intervened militarily on a unilateral basis in Kosovo, it is because the perspective of an intervention was rejected by the Russians, by the Chinese, and though they have no veto power in the UN Security Council, by the vast majority of the third world countries, the former colonial territories that had become independent and that during 4 years, from 45 to 85, had emphasized the necessity to respect non-interference. So a kind of opposition emerged. On the one hand, Western states favored intervention to humanitarian intervention, which is an armed intervention, which is a peace enforcement. And on the other hand, those states that were opposed to it. To get out of this stalemate, Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, proposed to think of a new principle, and this principle then became the very famous responsibility to protect principle. The responsibility to protect principle is based on the three following assumptions, which should distinguish it from the former duty to interfere or right to interfere humanitarian intervention. So the three assumptions of the R2P principle are the following one: the responsibility to protect principle. First, every state has the responsibility to protect its own population. So every state is sovereign, but sovereignty means the respect of human rights of the own population. Second assumption, the international community, the wider international community, including the non-liberal states in this case, should assist every state in order for every state to permit every state to be able to protect the basic human rights of its own population. And the third assumption then is the following one: if the state is unable to protect these human rights, then the international community must be prepared to take collective action in order for the sovereignty of the individuals, the basic human rights of these individuals to be protected, since the government of the populations concerned is unable to do so. So sovereignty exists, as stated explicitly in the UN Charter. Every state is sovereign, but it is sovereign to some extent as long as it respects the individual sovereignty, the sovereignty of the different members, the different citizens. And if it is unable to do so, its sovereignty is suspended in order to permit the international community to intervene and to reestablish the protection of human rights. And once this has been the case, well, the state becomes once again sovereign, as recovers its suspended sovereignty, and it re-becomes sovereign as it should be the case on the basis of the UN Charter, or the original reading of the UN Charter. So there is a difference between, according to those who proposed the R2P principle, it was elaborated by a Canadian commission in 2001, before being adopted in 2005 by all the member states of the UN. So there was a general consensus. The difference is that there is no more right to interfere. There is only a responsibility to protect if the state concerned is itself unable or unwilling, of course, to protect human rights. This principle of responsibility to protect, ladies and gentlemen, was put into practice in 2011 in the case of Libya. The Arab Spring had started in Tunisia, it spread to Egypt and then to Libya. A significant part of the population of Libya tried to introduce democracy, that is to say, to get rid of Gaddafi. Gaddafi refused, of course, to accept this revolution, and he did not hesitate to resort to violence, to military force, in order to crush the rebels. And therefore, if we come back to the definition of the responsibility to protect, Gaddafi's regime was perceived by the international community to be unable to protect the basic human rights of its own population. So a resolution was adopted under the initiative, notably of the French and of the British. Sarkozy was the French president, advised by Bernard-Henri, and Cameron was the British prime minister. A UN Security Resolution was adopted, Resolution 1973. You see that this resolution emphasizes the responsibility of the Libyan authorities to protect the Libyan population. It makes an allusion to the threat which the situation represents for international peace and security, and then it authorizes member states to take the necessary means to protect civilians, no occupation of the territory, excluding a foreign occupation force. The only concrete measure that was adopted was to establish a no-fly zone in order to prevent Gaddafi's aircraft to bomb the rebels, thanks to aircraft of NATO members, first the British and the French, and a bit later the Americans and other NATO members. So the responsibility to protect a principle was put into practice in Libya. The problem, however, is that after 2 or 3 weeks, NATO members intervening went beyond the explicit authorization of the establishment of a no-fly zone. That is to say, they ended up sending troops, or at least special agents, special forces, ground forces in Libya, and Gaddafi ended up being killed 6 months later. Michael Walzer, ladies and gentlemen, if there is one credible analyst in the domain of just and unjust wars, it is Michael Walzer. Immediately after the UN resolution had been adopted in March 2011, he rejected the justification, and to some extent he anticipated what was indeed taking place. The operation went further than the initial authorization. The consequence, ladies and gentlemen, was the following one. The situation in Libya ever since then is a never-ending mess. The situation in Sahel, terrorism, etc., is probably due to this initial intervention of NATO members ending up overthrowing Gaddafi's regime, which does not mean that I have some sympathy at all, of course, or any sympathy at all for the regime concerned. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese, since they saw that the Western states did go beyond the initial authorization, refused any further application of the R2P principle. And this explains why in Syria, the R2P principle was never put into practice. The Russians refused to accept it. And what's more, even worse to some extent precisely, Putin alludes to the responsibility to protect when intervening in Ukraine, as we saw at the beginning of today's lecture. I already said this, Putin is anything but credible, of course. But to say that he's wrong does not necessarily mean that the West is right. I can't help from thinking, ladies and gentlemen, that just as in Kosovo, in Libya too, the interventions of the West somehow resume with past military expeditions of the West. Military expeditions of the West of the past, which were basically illiberal and basically paternalist. The term humanitarian intervention, ladies and gentlemen, is a recent one. It goes back to the beginning of the 90s. But the practice of humanitarian intervention is anything but recent. The different scholars agree with this. Those who looked at justifications of military interventions from political thinkers, from Vittoria to Mill in the collection edited by Stefano Recchia and Jennifer Welch, and historians who looked at concrete humanitarian interventions of the past, such as those historians whose analyses were edited by Brandon Sims and DGB Trim. Humanitarian interventions, ladies and gentlemen, existed as early as in the 16th century. England, Elizabeth I was the English queen, intervened militarily in favor of Dutch and French Protestant victims of the Spanish monarchy, Catholic monarchy in the Netherlands, and victims of the French monarchy in France. And the English Cromwell, who had overthrown the English monarchy temporarily. There was a republic in England in the 1650s, intervened too, sent English troops to protect once again Protestants in the then Italian princedom of Piedmont. So at the end of the 16th and the mid of the 17th century, some humanitarian interventions already had been conceived of. These interventions then were abandoned by European states after the Westphalian peace because of the Westphalian Treaty adopting the sovereignty, that is to say, the non-interference principle. Humanitarian interventions re-emerged more than 1.5 centuries later, at the beginning of the 19th century, after Napoleon's defeat in the 1820s. No more did European states intervene in other European states, as had been the case during the religious quarrels. The English intervened in favor of Protestants against Catholics. No, the European states that intervened militarily intervened beyond Europe, beyond the line, notably in the Ottoman Empire. In 1820s, at the very end of the 1820s, to permit Greece to set itself free from the Ottomans. And at the very end of the 1850s, in 1860-61, in Lebanon, which at that time was still part of the Ottoman Empire, in order to protect the minority of Christians whose rights were violated by the majority of Muslims. And the US itself also practiced humanitarian interventions, notably in Cuba, 1898, in order to protect the Cubans who had started to try to become independent by getting rid of the Spanish colonial master. And when we look at justifications, and when we look at the political campaigns or the media campaigns in Europe or in the US at that time in the 19th century, they look and they sound very familiar to us. That is to say, the arguments are the same as the ones that I put forward up to now. America's intervention in Cuba was labeled a splendid little war by the then Secretary of State, John Hay, and the then American President, McKinley. This is what he said to justify American troops sent to protect the Cuban rebels. We took up arms only in obedience to the dictates of humanity in the fulfillment of high public and moral obligations. Morality is what is guiding us. We had no design of conquest, exactly the same argument as Blair or Putin. The American people never shirk a responsibility and never unload a burden that carries forward civilization, the white man's burden to permit civilization to expand. We accepted war against the Spaniards for humanity. We can accept no terms of peace which shall not be in the interest of humanity. Humanity, humanitarianism, human rights, the same argument as nowadays. When France intervened in Lebanon, Napoleon III was the French leader to protect Christians, Maronites Christians in Lebanon, which at the time was part of Syria, which at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire. The different media of in France at that time, l'Ami de la Religion, Le Moniteur, Le Constitutionnel, Le Siècle, they all were favorable to France intervening in order to do what? To protect them, I quote, to protect them, the Christians of Mount Lebanon and of Damascus, today's capital of Syria. And when the European powers, including Russia, intervened in Turkey, in Greece, to get rid of the Turks, to get rid of the Ottomans, the Battle of Navarino defeated the Turks. So it was a naval battle, and the justification was consisted in saying, I took this from Swatek's Evenstein's History of Humanitarian Intervention. It consisted in saying that the Ottoman Turk, I quote, was an alien substance embedded in the living flesh of Europe. So it had to be expelled from Greece, which was a European territory. And just as the rebels in Libya in 2011 appealed to French intellectuals, notably, as usual, Bernard-Henri Lévy, the then Greek independentist rebels appealed to Phil-Hellenic European intellectuals, poets such as Lamartine in France, such as Lord Byron in England, who even went to fight and he was killed during the battle in Greece, or the French painter Delacroix. There was a kind of sympathy for the Greeks, also because of Greece being at the origin of the Western civilization, against the barbaric Ottomans. So the comparison, ladies and gentlemen, between 19th century interventions and post-Cold War interventions obviously permits us to see that in all these cases, we have Westerners interfering in non-Westerners' domestic affairs. The non-Westerners in the 19th century were barbaric, were non-civilized. At the end of the 20s, beginning of the 21st century, they were autocratic and therefore different from our liberal democracies. The argumentation put forward during the 19th century by John Stuart Mill has been almost word by word updated by John Rawls nowadays in his Law of the Peoples. Look at John Stuart Mill. When two countries are engaged in a war, or two parts of the same country, when there is a risk of consequences repugnant to humanity or to generate, other countries have the right to step in. We have the right to step in, to interfere by force. And the only rules that we have to respect is the universal rules of morality, and not the non-interference principle of barbaric governments. John Rawls exactly puts forward the same idea. Military interventions might be called for if human rights violations are massive in outlaw states, rogue states, and we, Western states, liberal peoples, that is to say Western states, have a duty to assist other peoples living under unfavorable conditions, that is to say, burden societies, to use the typology of Rawls, that is to say, anarchy for Tesson, anarchy, too little government, outlaw states, rogue states, tyranny, too much government. Tesson, Mill, Rawls happen to be, ladies and gentlemen, liberal thinkers. Liberal or maybe illiberal, or should I say, a specific version of liberalism. Liberalism, ladies and gentlemen, is a very complex philosophy, and it includes, all the more so when it comes to international relations, that is, say, liberal internationalism or international liberalism, when it becomes a doctrine, it is composed by potentially contradictory principles or values. On the one hand, we have non-interference principles in other states' affairs, and on the other hand, we have the right to assistance to people in danger. On the one hand, we have no resort to force, as opposed to the realists, according to whom war is the mere continuation of foreign policy. Liberals reject this, but they nevertheless accept the right to defend oneself, which implies the use of force. So no use of force, but nevertheless use of force. And liberals basically are tolerant or claim to be tolerant, that is, they accept differences or diversity. But they also claim to be a cosmopolitan universalist, since human rights are universal values. So these potential contradictions when it comes to international politics are resolved in favor of cosmopolitan universalism, in favor of assistance to people, to endangered peoples, in favor of the right to interfere. Cosmopolitan universalism, why? Because liberals also have a teleological conception of history. History moves towards what Fukuyama calls the end of history. We, to some extent, are very close to this end of history. Therefore, we have the moral obligation to show other peoples, by definition, backwards, how to proceed, what to do in order to benefit from, to come closer to the end of history and to benefit from the advantages of this end of history, which concretely consists in a liberal society. To put it differently, ladies and gentlemen, I took this from James Richardson's analysis, contending liberalisms. There are different liberalisms. The liberal humanitarianism, our Western liberal democracies, humanitarian interventions are reflecting what we can call, I quote Richardson, the elitist liberalism from above, the liberalism of the privileged. And Samuel Moyn calls this the ideology of the powerful. And in doing so, we betray as much liberalism as we are faithful to it, or we betray, for instance, Kant's liberalism, who was opposed to any interference in any other state's domestic affairs in general, and also on the basis of his categorical imperative, we should not do to other ones what we do not want them to do to us. And precisely this is what our Western liberal governments refuse. We interfere, we have the right to interfere, but we do not want anybody else to interfere in our domestic affairs. Why? Well, because we consider ourselves to be a superior, which amounts to saying that our humanitarian interventions basically are based on a paternalist worldview. Paternalism, ladies and gentlemen, I took the definition in the second book of Barnett that I used today, Paternalism Beyond Borders. Paternalism is an attempt by one actor to substitute his or her judgment for another one's judgment on the grounds that it is in the latter interest or welfare. That is to say, we know better than the other one what this other one's freedom or what this other one's happiness consists in. But to posit this assumption amounts to convey a mix of emancipation and domination. It presupposes what we may call the dialectics of superiority and inferiority. By intervening, all the more so militarily, in another state to protect human rights, we contribute to emancipation because we set the people free from the repression that they are the victim of. So we contribute to their emancipation. But by intervening, we presuppose that they are unable themselves to get rid of the repression that they are the victim of, which amounts to saying that we do not permit them to choose themselves to some extent. We consider them to be inferior. They are unable to know what their interest consists in, freedom. This implies that we consider them to be inferior, which implies that we consider ourselves to be superior. And this superiority, this feeling of superiority, is all the more so true when after the military intervention, our NGOs, our experts, the different international organizations remain present in the state concerned in order to proceed to what we call state building, regime building, nation building, and all the more so democracy building. When we propose and implement what has been called humanitarian governance. Humanitarian governance is not a power-free zone. To permit a political situation to be stabilized, to claim that we have the skills to do that, to claim that we know how to permit a free press to emerge in a state at the end of the Civil War, by claiming that we are able to erect, to create a police force respectable of that respects the human rights of the population, etc. Well, of course, it proves that we are that we use that our power is used to promote ethical, moral objectives, aims, a positive, noble, of course, but power too is also power over those individuals, those societies, those states that are the objects of our care. There, where there is care, there is also a domination. And all the more so since NGOs go hand in hand with powerful Western states. The agendas of NGOs and the agendas of states overlap pretty often during the last 30 years or so. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, my analysis, of course, is anything but neutral, and it is based basically on a personal philosophy, a personal conviction, according to which autonomous choice trumps everything else. I do not want anybody to tell me what my freedom or what my happiness should consist in. But my opinion is not important, of course. Much more important, ladies and gentlemen, and much more dangerous to some extent for Western societies is the fact that the Western presence in failed or rogue states after military interventions, this Western presence is perceived by some people living in the states concerned as synonymous with the imposition of Western values. Of course, those who have this perception, most of them satisfy with criticizing what they consider to be Western neo-imperialism or Western neo-colonialism. But some of them try to get rid of the Western presence. And what do they do? What are they tempted to do? What may be tempted to do? They may resort to violent means themselves in order to get rid of the Western presence. Among them, of course, are terrorist networks, and we will logically see if the terrorist attacks that occurred in our Western societies are not the backlash of our Western democratic humanitarian wars. This will be the topic of our chapter 11, the last chapter of our Democracies at War lectures. Thank you very much for attending today's class. I wish you a great day and see you again next week. Goodbye.